Jack Callahan didn't go looking for trouble that scorching July morning. He went looking for strays. What he found instead was a woman lying face down in the tall grass at the edge of his fence line, her dress torn, her hands bleeding, her breathing so shallow he thought he was already too late. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her past. And he sure didn't know that pulling her off that hard Montana dirt was about to unravel every quiet, ordinary thing he'd ever built, and hand him the only thing he never knew he needed. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way through. You will not want to miss a single moment. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The grass was dead. That was the first thing Jack Callahan noticed when he rode out that morning. Not the heat pressing down on the valley like a hand over a mouth. Not the dry crack of the earth splitting open along the creek bed. Not even the silence where the birds ought to be. It was the grass. Burnt yellow from roots to tips, laid flat by 3 weeks without rain, spread out across his land like a burial shroud over something that used to be alive. He pulled Remy to a stop at the north fence line and just looked at it for a moment. 8 years he'd worked this land. 8 years of hard winters, dry summers, busted equipment and borrowed money, and neighbors who smiled at church and undercut him at auction. 8 years, and the double C was still standing, still his. He told himself that mattered. He was turning Remy back toward the barn when the horse stopped short and threw her head sideways, ears sharp and forward, nostrils wide. "Easy," Jack said, low and firm. "Easy, girl." Remy didn't settle. She sidestepped, tossing her head again, and that was when Jack saw it. A shape in the grass, maybe 50 yards ahead, just beyond the fence line where his property met the open range. Something low and dark and wrong. He nudged Remy forward, slow. The shape didn't move. He was off the horse before she fully stopped, his boots hitting the cracked earth hard, and he was running before he let himself think about why. Some animal part of him already knowing what his eyes hadn't confirmed yet. He pushed through the fence gap and dropped to his knees beside her, and his hands were on her shoulders before anything else registered. The torn fabric, the blood matted into her dark hair just above her ear, the way her fingers were curled into the dirt, like she'd been trying to drag herself somewhere and just couldn't make it any farther. "Hey," he turned her over, careful. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her face was pale under the sun. A long cut along her jaw already swelling, her lips cracked and dry. She was young, not young like a girl, but young like a woman who hadn't yet been beaten all the way down. Her dress was fine, finer than anything that belonged out here on the open range. The fabric, a deep blue that might have been pretty before whatever happened to her got through with it. Her eyes opened. They were gray, clear and sharp and full of something that hit him square in the chest before he could guard against it. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that had already looked fear in the face and decided it wasn't done yet. "Don't," she said, and her voice was barely sound, just breath shaped into a word. "Don't move me." "Ma'am, I need to get you out of this sun. I said, don't move me." Her hand came up and gripped his wrist, and the strength in her fingers surprised him enough that he held still, her eyes fixed on his face, reading him the way you read a horizon. Looking for weather, looking for threat. "Who are you?" "Name's Jack Callahan. My land runs up to this fence line. I live about a quarter mile that direction." He kept his voice even. "Now who are you? And what happened to you?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved past him, scanning the tree line, scanning the ridge above the creek, scanning in a way that wasn't random. She was looking for something specific. Someone specific. "Are you alone?" she asked. Yes, ma'am. Your horse. Is that your only horse? Only one I rode out here. Got 3 more at the barn. He paused. Ma'am, respectfully, you are bleeding from your head in July heat, and I need to get you somewhere cool and still. I will answer every question you got, but I need you to let me help you first. Something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly, more like a calculation completed. She'd weighed him, and he'd come out on the better side of it, though he couldn't have said why. And he had the feeling she wasn't a woman who gave that kind of decision lightly. All right, she said. All right, he said back. I'm going to lift you now. Tell me if something's broken. My ribs are bruised. Left side. Not broken. How do you know? Because I know what broken feels like. He didn't ask. He got his arms under her, careful, and stood. And she made one sharp sound against her teeth, and then nothing else. And he carried her to Remy and got her up into the saddle, and mounted behind her, and kept one arm across her middle the whole ride back to keep her from listing sideways, which she tried to do twice. She didn't say anything during the ride. Neither did he. He settled her in the back bedroom, the one that used to be his mother's, the one with the window that faced west and caught the afternoon shade. And he brought water and clean cloth, and did what his mother had taught him to do about wounds, without asking too many questions while doing it. The cut above her ear was shallow, but long. The bruising along her ribs he took on faith. Her left wrist was wrapped in something already, a strip of her own dress, tied tight and neat, and he let it be. She sat up against the headboard and watched him work with those gray eyes and said nothing. When he was done, he pulled the chair away from the wall and sat down and looked at her straight. I'll ask again, he said. What's your name? A pause. Short, but there. Ellen, she said. Ellen Marsh. It wasn't her name. He knew that the same way he knew weather before it came. Something in the set of her jaw, the practiced ease of it, the way her eyes stayed steady instead of shifting the way most people's did when they lied. She'd said that name before. It was a name she kept ready. He decided to let it sit. All right, Ellen. What happened to you? My horse threw me. Your horse threw you, he repeated. Yes. And the cut on your jaw? From the fall. And your wrist? Also from the fall. He nodded slowly. That must have been some fall. It was, she said, and her chin went up just slightly, daring him to push it. He didn't. Not yet. Where were you headed? North? She hesitated. I was trying to reach Millhaven. Millhaven was 15 miles north. He thought about that. You were riding toward Millhaven alone? He said. I was? In July heat. I'm aware of the month. With no supplies I can see and no extra horse, across open range that's got 3 dry creek beds between here and there and not a soul for 8 miles in any direction. She met his eyes. I didn't say my planning was excellent. He almost smiled. He caught it before it got all the way out. No, ma'am. I reckon you didn't. She looked at the window. Outside, the heat sat thick and golden over everything, and somewhere out past the barn, one of his horses was moving in the paddock, hooves slow on the dry ground. I can pay you, she said, for the room, for the trouble. I have... She stopped, recalculated. I can arrange payment when I reach Millhaven. I don't need payment. I don't accept charity. Good thing I'm not offering any. I'm offering a meal and a bed and the use of my well until you're steady on your feet. He stood up. You want to argue about it, You can do it from the porch. You try to argue about it on horseback before tomorrow morning, I'll tie Remy to the fence and we'll both stand here until you see sense." She stared at him. He stared back. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he agreed, and went to start dinner. He made salt pork and biscuits, and a pot of coffee that was more grounds than water because he was running low. And he set a plate outside the bedroom door and knocked and said it was there and went back to eating his own at the kitchen table. About 10 minutes later, he heard her moving, heard the door, heard the chair scrape. When he came back to clear the plates, both plates were empty and the coffee cup was dry. She came out to the kitchen an hour after that. She'd done something with her hair, pinned it up off her neck against the heat, covered the bandage. And she'd done what she could with the dress, though there wasn't much to do about the tear at the shoulder. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with that careful gray gaze, and he kept his eyes on the lamp wick he was trimming, and let her decide what she wanted to say. "You have livestock," she said. "Some." "Cattle?" 63 head, down from 90 last fall." He set the trimmer down. "Dry summer." She was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been here, on this land?" 8 years. "Alone?" He looked up at that. She held his gaze without flinching, which he was already starting to understand was just how she was. Not aggressive, not defensive, just direct. Like a woman who'd learned that looking away cost more than it saved. "My wife passed 4 years ago," he said. "Fever." "I'm sorry." "So am I." He picked up the trimmer again. "You got family in Millhaven?" Another one of those short pauses. "I'm meeting someone there." "Someone who knows you're coming?" "Yes." "Someone who's going to be wondering where you are about now?" The pause was longer this time. Something moved behind her eyes. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. Something urgent. "Mr. Callahan," she said, and her voice had shifted, dropped lower, lost the careful surface of it. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He set the trimmer down again. "All right. Have any riders come through your land today? Come through or passed close by?" He thought about it. "No." "Yesterday?" "No. Why?" She looked at the window. The sun was down now, the sky going deep blue above the ridge, and the room was full of that particular silence that summer evenings had in Montana, when the day's heat lifted just slightly, and you could hear the distance in things. "There are men looking for me," she said. He didn't move. "What kind of men?" "The kind you pay to find things you've lost." She turned back to him. "Or things you want found." "And they want you found?" "Yes." "Who's doing the paying?" She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding again. The same weighing he'd seen out in the grass. The same careful calculation. And he stayed still and let her do it, because he understood by now that pushing her was exactly the wrong approach. "Someone who believes he has a claim on something that belongs to me," she said finally, "and who is willing to do considerable damage to make that claim stick." "What does he have a claim on?" Her jaw tightened. "Land." Jack looked at her steadily. "How much land?" She met his eyes. "Enough that it matters." He thought about that for a long time. Outside, the crickets started up in the grass, and somewhere down by the creek something splashed, and the world went on being exactly what it was, dry and hard and indifferent to the particulars of who wanted what from whom. "You're welcome to stay until you're fit to ride," he said finally. "My door locks from the inside. My rifle is loaded, and I sleep light." He stood up from the table. "Whoever's looking for you, would have to come through me to get to you, and I don't recommend that." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't quite done yet, like she was seeing past the surface of the man to whatever was underneath. And he bore it the way he bore most things, straight and still. "Why?" she said. "You don't know me." "No, ma'am, I don't." He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "But I know a person in trouble, and I know what it looks like when somebody decides trouble's not their problem. I made that mistake once." He put the hat on. "I don't aim to make it twice." She didn't say anything. He went out to check the horses. He didn't sleep well. Not because of her, or not entirely. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle, and thought about what she'd said. Land. Someone with a claim. Men sent to find her. The careful way she'd answered every question just close enough to the truth to be convincing, without ever giving him the actual truth. Ellen Marsh. He'd ridden into Millhaven a handful of times over the past year for supplies, and he'd heard the name Marsh exactly once, attached to a piece of gossip that had run through the saloon and the general store and the church social, the way gossip did in small towns, loud and fast and full of itself. Old Gerald Marsh, owner of the Marsh Cattle Company, largest ranch operation in the Northern Territory, dead of a heart attack in May. No widow. No sons. Daughter somewhere back east, they said. Hadn't been seen in years. He stared at the ceiling. Ellen Marsh. Her dress. Fine fabric, even torn. The way she'd looked at his spread with those careful eyes. Not the eyes of a woman taking in something unfamiliar, but the eyes of a woman doing an appraisal. The wrist wrapped before he got to her, done neat and tight, like a woman who knew exactly how to wrap an injury. The way she'd said someone believed he had a claim on something that belongs to me, without a tremor in her voice, like she'd been carrying that sentence for a long time and knew the weight of it precisely. He turned over and closed his eyes. In the morning, he decided, he'd ask her straight. No soft edges, no patience for deflection. He'd ask her straight and give her the same in return, and they'd see what happened after that. He'd just reached the thin edge of sleep when he heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one horse. 3, maybe 4, coming in from the south, at a pace that wasn't casual. Not the amble of a rider passing through, but the deliberate approach of men who knew where they were going. He was on his feet before the sound fully registered, boots on and rifle in hand, moving through the dark house, fast and quiet. He put his back to the wall beside the front window and looked out through the gap in the curtain. 4 riders, stopping at his fence line, not coming through, yet. One of them held a lantern, and in its light, Jack could make out the shape of men who were built for work that wasn't ranching. Broad, deliberate. The kind of men who had been hired, and not for their manners. The one in front called out, "Hello, the house!" Jack didn't move. "Callahan." The voice was flat and practiced. "We know you're awake. We seen your light go out." Behind him, barely a sound. A door hinge. A breath. He turned just enough to see her standing in the hallway in the dark. And even without light, he could see she'd gone rigid. "Don't," she said, just a shape of sound. "Stay back," he said, just as quiet. "Stay out of the window light." She moved back against the hall wall, and he turned back to the window. "What do you want?" he called out. "Just a conversation," the man said. "Got reason to believe a woman might have passed through your property today. Young woman, dark hair, blue dress. We're trying to see she gets home safe." The word safe landed wrong. Jack had heard that word used the same way before. Gentle on the outside, with something hard and specific underneath it. "Ain't seen anybody like that," he said. A pause. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure about what I seen on my own land," Jack said. Same as I'm sure about what's on my land right now. 4 riders, after dark, uninvited. Another pause. Longer. Mr. Callahan, the man said, and his voice had changed just slightly, the cordial edge of it thinning. We don't have any quarrel with you. No, Jack said, you don't. And you want to keep it that way, you'll turn those horses around. He heard them talking, too low to make out words. He watched the one with the lantern lift it slightly, trying to see through the window. And Jack held still and let the darkness work. Then they turned, not fast, slow, the way men turned when they were making a point about not being afraid, and rode back south, and the hoofbeats faded, and the night went quiet again. He stayed at the window for a long time. When he finally turned around, she was still in the hallway, pressed against the wall, and even in the darkness, he could see the look on her face. Not relief, not gratitude, but something wound tight and complicated. Something that lived right at the junction of fury and grief. They'll come back, she said. Probably, he agreed. You should have let them take me. Her voice was flat. You don't know what you've stepped into. Jack set the rifle against the wall and looked at her. No, he said, I don't. So why don't you tell me? She looked at him. Something in her face shifted, the careful surface of it cracking, just slightly, just at the edges. And he saw what was underneath it, finally. Not weakness, not helplessness. Something older and harder than either of those. A woman who had been fighting something alone for a very long time and was running out of room. My name isn't Ellen, she said. I know. She straightened off the wall. My name is Claire. Claire Montgomery. She paused. Gerald Montgomery was my father. The Montgomery Ranch is mine by law and by blood. And the man who sent those riders wants it. And he will burn this entire valley to the ground to get it. Jack looked at her for a long moment. The Montgomery Ranch. Every man, woman, and child from here to the territory line knew that name. 140,000 acres. The largest cattle operation in the northern half of the state. The kind of land that made men into kings and turned kings into something worse. And she was standing barefoot in his hallway, in a torn dress, bleeding and hunted, and looking at him like she was daring him to turn away. All right, Claire, he said. She blinked, like she hadn't expected him to say her name. All right, he said again. Then I reckon you'd better tell me everything. She didn't sit down to tell it. She stood in that hallway with her spine straight and her hands loose at her sides, and she talked the way a person talked when they'd been holding something in so long it had started to calcify. Not with tears, not with trembling, but with a kind of controlled, deliberate precision that was almost worse than either. Her father had died in May. Heart gave out on a Tuesday morning, sitting in the chair he always sat in, coffee going cold beside him. The foreman found him. That foreman was a man named Thaddeus Hart, and he had been running the Montgomery operation for 6 years. And in those 6 years, he had made himself indispensable in the way that certain men made themselves indispensable. Quietly, thoroughly, like a weed that grows so deep you can't pull it without taking the whole root system with it. He wrote to me, Claire said, after my father died, said I should come home, said there were papers to sign, said he'd have everything ready for me. Her jaw tightened. What he had ready was a deed of transfer, already drawn up, already signed by 2 witnesses I'd never heard of. My father's name at the bottom, in handwriting that wasn't my father's handwriting. Jack stood very still. A forgery. A very good one. Her eyes were hard. Good enough that the county clerk in Millhaven accepted it. Good enough that Thaddeus Hart has been telling anyone who'll listen that Gerald Montgomery signed over controlling interest in the ranch to him 2 weeks before he died, in exchange for debts owed. She stopped. My father didn't have debts. He paid everything he owed in cash, the day it came due, his whole life. It was the only rule he never broke. You can prove that? I can if I can get to the ranch house. There are records, ledgers going back 15 years. My father kept everything. She looked at him steadily, which is exactly why Thaddeus wants me gone before I get there. Gone, Jack said. You mean gone or gone? The word hung between them. The men he sent tonight, she said. Their names are Cord Reyes and the Dillon brothers, Elias and Pete. They have done work for Thaddeus before, the kind of work that ends quietly. Jack picked up the rifle off the wall, not pointing it anywhere, just holding it, the weight of it familiar and grounding.
How do you know all this if you've been back east? Because I have a friend in Millhaven, Mary Sutton. She wrote to me. 3 letters, each one a little more frightened than the last. Claire's voice thinned. The last one said that Thaddeus had told people in town that I'd refused to come home, that I'd abandoned my claim, that the land was his by default and by law. She stopped again, and something cracked through the controlled surface of her voice, just for a second, just one word deep. My father built that ranch from nothing. He drove cattle up from Texas with 6 men and a prayer when he was 23 years old. He buried 2 partners and 1 brother in that ground, and he kept going. And Thaddeus Hart wants to put his name on it. Her chin came up. I won't allow it. Jack looked at her. The lamp in the kitchen threw just enough light down the hallway to see her face, and what he saw there wasn't bravado, and it wasn't performance. It was the kind of resolve that got built slowly, over a long time, by a person who had learned the hard way that nobody was coming to fight their battles for them. What's your plan? He said. She blinked, like that wasn't what she'd expected him to say. I need to reach the ranch house, she said. The records are in the study. My father's personal ledgers and the original deed of title, registered in my name before I turned 18. If I can get to those before Thaddeus does. If he doesn't already have them. He doesn't. She said it flat and certain. The study locks from the inside with a key my father kept on a chain he wore every day of his life. That key is not in any document Thaddeus controls. I know where it is. Where? Around his neck, she said. He was buried with it. In the cemetery on the north pasture of the ranch. A pause. No one else knew that. Jack was quiet for a moment. So you'd have to go to the ranch? Yes, past Thaddeus Hart and his hired men. Yes. With no horse of your own, no supplies, a bruised rib, a cut head, and 4 men already having been to my fence line tonight looking for you. Yes. She met his eyes. I didn't say it was a good plan, Mr. Callahan. I said it was the only one. He looked at her for a long time. Then he turned and walked to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of that terrible coffee and stood at the table and thought. The smart thing, the obvious, self-preserving, sensible thing, was to stay out of it. He had 63 head of cattle that needed water he didn't have enough of, a fence line on the east side that needed mending before it came down entirely, and a banknote coming due in October that he was not certain he could meet. He had no business riding into the middle of a land dispute involving 140,000 acres and a man who hired people to make problems disappear. He drank the coffee. I know the north road to the Montgomery Ranch, he said. 15 miles if you stick to the main trail. 12 if you cut through the Garner Creek Basin, but that's dry now, and the horses'll know it. He heard her come into the kitchen behind him. There's a woman in Millhaven, he said. Mary Sutton. You said she wrote to you? Yes. I know Mary Sutton. Her husband Walt runs the feed store. Good people.
He set down the cup. If we go to Millhaven first, get Mary's testimony about what she's seen and heard, and find the town lawyer. There's a man named Elias Pratt, been practicing in that county for 20 years. We have something more than your word against Hart's. She came to stand at the other side of the table. That will take time. Every day we wait, every day we ride in without witnesses and without a lawyer, he said. We're just two people on a piece of land that Hart's going to say you have no claim to.
You need the law on your side before you walk through that gate. Otherwise, he calls in those riders, and it ends badly. He looked up at her. For you, not for him. The silence stretched. He watched her work through it, watched the pride and the urgency in her face, do battle with a part of her that knew he was right. You'd come with me, she said. I'll come with you. Why? It wasn't really a question, or maybe it was, but not the kind that wanted a simple answer. He thought about telling her about the reason he'd really ridden north after his wife died, the reason he'd pushed as far from his old life as he could get, and put himself on this piece of difficult land and dug in. He thought about telling her about the man he used to be, the one who looked away when looking away was easier, and what it had cost him. Because it's right, he said instead, and because I can. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she sat down. All right, she said. We leave at first light. All right. He went to get her a blanket, and she didn't argue, and that was how he knew she was more exhausted than she was letting on. He was saddling the horses before the sun cleared the ridge when he heard the first horse coming. Not 4 this time. 1. Coming in fast from the east, not the south, not the same direction as last night's riders. And Jack had the rifle up and his back to the barn wall before the rider came through the fence gap, and he recognized the horse before he recognized the man. Bay mare, white stocking on the left foreleg. Walt Sutton's horse. The rider wasn't Walt. It was a boy, maybe 16, 17, hatless and sweating, and riding like something was chasing him. He pulled up hard in front of the barn and nearly came off the horse and grabbed the saddle horn and looked at Jack with eyes that had too much in them for a face that young. Mr. Callahan, he said, breathing hard. My ma sent me, Mary Sutton. She said to find you if I could. She said there's a woman, dark hair. She said you might have her. Jack lowered the rifle. Slow down. What's your name? Thomas. Thomas Sutton. He was still catching his breath. Mr. Callahan, they came to our store last night. Cord Reyes and the Dillon brothers. Asked my pa about a woman coming through town. Asked about the Montgomery ranch. Asked about who the lawyer in town talked to. His voice shook once, and he steadied it by force. My pa told them nothing. They broke the front window when they left. Jack's jaw tightened. My ma says to tell the woman, the one you might have, that Thaddeus Hart rode into Millhaven yesterday afternoon. In person. Went straight to the county clerk's office with 2 men, and came out an hour later, and he was smiling. Thomas looked at him. My ma says that means the deed went through. Official. As of yesterday, the Montgomery ranch belongs to Thaddeus Hart on paper. The words hit like a fist. Jack heard the farmhouse door, and Claire was already coming across the yard, still buttoning her cuff, and she read something in his face before he said a word, and she stopped walking. What happened? She said. It wasn't a question. He told her straight. He watched every word land. She didn't crumple, and she didn't cry, but her face went through something that was worse than either of those. A kind of terrible stillness, like a person taking a blow they'd already halfway been expecting, and finding out that expecting it didn't make it hurt less. That's not possible, she said, very quietly. The original deed in the study is still there, Jack said, and it still matters.
An original registered deed outweighs a transfer document, especially one dated after the owner's death. Pratt would know that. He looked at her. This isn't over. It's just harder. She looked at Thomas. Your mother, is she safe? Yes, ma'am.
She sent me out the back before those men came into the store. She's at my aunt's house. He hesitated. She also said to tell you, she saved the letters. The one she wrote you, and one your father wrote her, from about 2 weeks before he died. Claire's breath caught. What did it say? Jack asked. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, creased from travel and careful handling. She said she copied it out by hand, the important part. Said you'd understand. Claire took it. Her hands were steady. She unfolded it and read it, and whatever was in it moved across her face like weather moving across a plain, fast and then gone, replaced by something clear and hard and decided. She folded it back up. He knew, she said. My father knew something was wrong. He wrote to Mary because he didn't trust sending a letter through town. She looked at Jack. He said Hart had been pressuring him to sign something. He said he'd refused.
He said, if anything happened to him,
Her voice held.
he said, Claire knows where to look.
Jack looked at her. The key, she said.
He'd already planned for it. He already knew.
Something crossed her face then that was grief and pride and fury all at once, layered over each other so deep you couldn't separate them.
He tried to protect it, even at the end.
Thomas was looking between them. What do you want me to do? Jack made the decision in about 3 seconds. You ride back to town. Don't go to the store. Go to Elias Pratt's office. You know where that is? Yes, sir. You tell him Jack Callahan needs to see him today. Tell him it's about the Montgomery property, and there's an original deed and a forged transfer document, and a man who's going to be very unhappy when it comes out which one is real. Can you remember all that? Yes, sir. Tell him to come to Walt Sutton's feed store at noon. We'll be there. Thomas looked at Claire.
Ma'am, my mother wanted me to tell you she's sorry. She said she wished she'd written sooner. She said she hoped... He stopped, swallowed. She said your father was a good man. Claire looked at the boy for a long moment. Something in her face went soft, just briefly, the way a hard thing went soft when it was touched in the right place. Tell your mother thank you. Tell her to keep those letters safe. She paused. Tell her I'm going to finish what my father started. Thomas nodded once, hard, the way young men nodded when they wanted to show they understood the weight of something. And he turned the bay mare and rode back the way he'd come. Jack and Claire looked at each other. We still ride to Millhaven first? He said. Yes, she tied off her cuff. But we go armed. I was already planning on it. They were on the horses and moving inside 10 minutes. The road to Millhaven cut through open country for the first 7 miles, which meant they could see anyone approaching from a good distance. And Jack kept one eye on the horizon the whole time, and one hand loose near the rifle in its scabbard. Claire rode beside him without complaint, and without conversation for the first stretch. And he let the silence sit because he understood it. She was doing the same thing he was doing, running through every variable, trying to see what was coming before it arrived. At the 4-mile mark, she said, How well do you know Elias Pratt? Well enough. He drew up my property deed 8 years ago. Decent man. Careful. Jack glanced at her. He won't be bought. You sure about that? No one's sure about anything until they're tested, Jack said. But some men test predictably. She was quiet. Then, What did you mean last night, when you said you'd made the mistake of looking away before? He looked at the road.
The question had weight to it. Not nosiness, not small talk. Real weight. The kind a person asked when they were trying to understand who was riding beside them. "My wife," he said, before she got sick. There was a man in the town we lived in, down in Wyoming, running a scheme against some of the smaller homesteaders, buying up their water rights through bad contracts, cutting them off in dry years. He kept his eyes forward. I knew about it, saw what was happening. Told myself it wasn't my business, wasn't my land. I had enough of my own trouble to manage. He paused. 3 families lost everything. Good people. One of them was an old couple who'd been on their land longer than I'd been alive. Claire didn't say anything. My wife found out I'd known and done nothing, he said. She didn't yell at me about it. She was worse than that. She just looked at me one long time and said, "I didn't know you were that kind of man." His jaw worked. She forgave me. We were all right. But I never forgot the way she looked at me, saying it. He felt Claire's eyes on the side of his face. "I'm not telling you that for sympathy," he said. "I'm telling you because when I found you in that grass, I knew what kind of decision I was standing at. And I already knew which side of it I could live with." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," Jack said simply. They rode on. It was the 5-mile mark when Claire's horse tossed her head, and Jack saw the dust. Not one rider, not 4. He pulled Remy up and put one hand out, and Claire stopped alongside him, and they both looked south, where the road bent around a low rise, and the dust was rising wrong. Too broad, too fast. The kind of dust that a group of horses made when they'd been sent somewhere in a hurry. "That's not Thomas coming back," Claire said. "No," Jack said. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the small revolver that Jack had given her before they left. His wife's gun. A .38 she'd kept loaded and ready under the kitchen floorboard. And she checked the cylinder the way someone checked a cylinder when they'd done it before. Jack had the rifle out. "How many do you figure?" she asked. 6, maybe more. She looked at him, and her eyes were calm in a way that should have been impossible given the situation. Calm the way the center of something was calm. And he looked back at her and understood something in that moment that he hadn't quite understood before. That she had never really been running. She had been maneuvering. "Jack," she said. First time she'd used his given name. "I need you to trust me." "I'm listening." "Don't fire first," she said. "Whatever happens, don't fire first." He looked at the dust. Back at her. "What are you planning?" She straightened in the saddle, and something about her changed. Not her face, not her posture exactly, but the quality of her stillness. Like a woman stepping fully and finally into who she actually was. "I'm going to remind Thaddeus Hart," she said, "that he does not know everything." The riders came around the bend, and Thaddeus Hart was at the front. Thaddeus Hart was not what Jack had expected. He'd built a picture of the man from Claire's words, something broad and brutal, the kind of man who wore his meanness on the outside. What rode toward them on a tall black horse was something more careful than that. Hart was maybe 50, lean in the way that men who worked other people hard stayed lean, with a face that had learned a long time ago how to look reasonable. He was dressed well, not flashy, well. The kind of well that said, "I have money, and I've had it long enough that I don't need to prove it." He held up one hand, and his riders stopped behind him, spread out in a loose line across the road. 6 men. Cord Reyes on the left, 2 others Jack didn't know, and the Dillon brothers on the far right, looking like they'd been awake all night and hadn't softened any for it.
Hart looked at Claire and smiled. It was the worst kind of smile. The kind that said, "I've already won, and we both know it. And isn't it a shame you made this so difficult?" "Claire," he said. "Lord, but you gave us a fright. All the way out here, on your own." He shook his head, slow and sorrowful. "Your father would have been beside himself." Claire didn't move a muscle. "Thaddeus? We've been looking for you since yesterday morning." His eyes moved to Jack, measured him, filed him, dismissed him in about 2 seconds. "This a friend of yours?" "This is Jack Callahan," Claire said. "He owns the Double C Ranch south of here. He's been kind enough to escort me." "Escort you?" Hart smiled again.
Escort you where, exactly? To Millhaven, to see Elias Pratt.
Something shifted in Hart's face. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes, a fraction of a second. And then it was gone, smoothed back over, and the reasonable expression was back in place. But Jack had seen it. Claire had seen it too. He could tell from the way she didn't react to it, the deliberate way she kept her face neutral. "Now why would you need a lawyer?" Hart said. "We're family, Claire. Your father trusted me with everything he had." "He trusted you to run the cattle operation," she said, "not to own it." "Well now, that's a misunderstanding I'd be happy to clear up." He reached into his coat, and Jack's hand moved toward the rifle without quite touching it, and Hart noticed, and slowed the reach deliberately, making a show of being unthreatening, and pulled out a folded document and held it toward her. "The deed's all in order, witnessed and filed. Your father's own signature."
I know this is hard, losing him, coming back to find things different than you expected.
"That's not his signature," Claire said. "Claire, I grew up watching my father sign his name." Her voice was level and absolute. "He crossed the T in Montgomery with a single stroke that went left before it went right. A habit from childhood he never lost. Every document in those ledgers has it. That signature does not." Dead silence. Hart looked at her. The reasonable expression stayed in place, but underneath it something had gone cold and flat, and Jack read it the same way he read weather. This was a man recalculating, not retreating. "A man's handwriting changes as he ages," Hart said. The county clerk was satisfied. "The county clerk saw what you needed him to see," Claire said. "Elias Pratt will look closer." "Elias Pratt works for whoever pays him, same as any man." "No," Jack said quietly. "He doesn't." Hart looked at him again. This time the look lasted longer.
You'd be wise to stay out of this, Mr. Callahan. This is a family matter.
"She's got no family left," Jack said, "which makes it a legal matter. And a legal matter needs witnesses." He held Hart's gaze. "You're looking at one." The silence stretched out thin and tight as a wire. Then Cord Reyes moved his horse 2 steps forward on the left, and Pete Dillon moved on the right, and the shape of the group changed, closed in, not dramatically, just enough that the message was clear. "Jack," Claire's voice was quiet, warning. "I see it," he said. Hart sighed, like this was all a great inconvenience. "Claire, I'm going to ask you one more time to come with us back to the ranch and sit down and have a civil conversation about this. Your father would not have wanted his daughter standing in the middle of a road making accusations against a man who gave 20 years of service to the Montgomery name."
My father, Claire said, wrote a letter to Mary Sutton 2 weeks before he died, saying you'd been pressuring him to sign documents he didn't understand and that he was afraid.
The reasonable expression cracked. Not all the way, but enough. "Mary Sutton," Hart said, "is a feed store wife with a grudge and an imagination." "Mary Sutton has the letter." The crack widened. "That's not—" He stopped, restarted. Whatever Mary Sutton claims to have is currently in the hands of Elias Pratt, Claire said, along with a copy I've already sent by yesterday's mail to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. She was lying. Jack knew she was lying. He was almost certain Hart knew she was lying. But the Territorial Land Office in Helena was a name that landed differently than Elias Pratt. It was bigger, farther, harder to manage, the kind of authority that couldn't be smoothed over with a conversation and a smile. Hart looked at her for a long moment.
"You haven't had time to send anything to Helena," he said.
"Try me," she said. Another silence. Longer. Jack kept his eyes on Cord Reyes because Reyes was the one who'd move first if someone moved. He had the look of a man who ran on someone else's orders and had his orders. And the only question was when. Hart turned his horse. "We'll sort this in town," he said, his back half to them, "through proper channels." "That's all I've ever asked," Claire said. Hart rode back through his men, and they parted for him and reformed behind him. And as they went, Cord Reyes looked back over his shoulder at Jack with a look that was not ambiguous. Jack held it until Reyes looked away. They waited until the riders were out of sight before either of them moved. Jack let out a long, slow breath. "You don't have anything in Helena." "Not yet," she said. "You bought us about half a day." "Half a day is enough." She was already moving, turning her horse toward Millhaven. "He'll go back to the ranch and think. He won't move in town in front of witnesses. He needs this to look legitimate." She glanced at Jack. "That's his weakness. He wants the land, but he wants his name clean." "Men like that," Jack said, "when they can't keep their name clean, they stop caring about it." "I know." She didn't slow down. "Which is why we need to move." Mary Sutton was a small woman with strong hands and eyes that had been frightened recently but hadn't given in to it. And when Claire walked through the back door of the feed store and Mary saw her, she put both arms around her without a word and held on. And Claire let her, just for a moment, just long enough. "Your father talked about you," Mary said, pulling back and looking at her face. "Every time he came in. Every single time." Claire's throat moved. "I know. I should have come back sooner." "You're here now." Mary turned to Jack, and something in her expression was grateful and exhausted and determined all at once. "Mr. Callahan, thank you for bringing her." "She'd have found her way here without me," Jack said, and he meant it. Thomas was in the back room, and Walt Sutton came down from upstairs with a shotgun he was not pointing at anyone, but was not putting down either. And when Claire explained where things stood, he set the gun against the wall and pulled up a chair, and listened with the focus of a man who understood that some things you had to see all the way through. Elias Pratt arrived at noon exactly. He was older than Jack remembered. Late 60s now, white-haired, with the careful movements of a man who had learned that most things didn't need to be rushed. He sat down across from Claire, and he listened without interrupting. And when she was done, he held out his hand for Mary's copy of Gerald Montgomery's letter and read it twice. Then he set it down and folded his hands on the table. "The forged deed is a serious matter," he said. "If we can demonstrate the signature is fraudulent, and what you're describing about the cross-stroke is the kind of specific, documentable detail that carries weight, we have grounds to challenge the transfer." He looked at Claire. "The problem is time. A challenged deed goes to the territorial court. That takes weeks, possibly months." "We don't have weeks," Claire said. "He'll strip the ranch." "I know." Pratt was quiet for a moment. "There's another approach. The original deed of title registered in your name. You said it's in the study at the ranch house?" "Yes." "If we can retrieve it and get it to the county clerk's office with a sworn affidavit from you, Sutton, and Callahan, and the letter from your father, We can file an injunction against any transfer of property pending investigation. That freezes Hart's claim. He can't sell, can't borrow against it, can't deed it to anyone else." Pratt looked at her. "But to file the injunction, we need the original deed in hand."
"I know where to get it," Claire said. "The lock on your father's study."
"Yes," Pratt looked at her steadily. "Hart will have men at the ranch." "I know. Going there tonight is the only way," she said. "He knows we're moving toward the legal channel. He'll start dismantling whatever he can. The ledgers, the records, anything that supports the original deed." She looked at Pratt. "If he gets to those before I do, we have the letter and my word against a filed county document. You know what a jury does with that." Pratt was quiet. Then slowly, he nodded. "I'll have the injunction paperwork ready to file at first light. All I'll need is your signature and the deed." He looked at Jack. "You're going with her." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jack said. "Then take Walt's wagon. Faster than horses for what you're carrying back, and less suspicious after dark if you move quiet." Pratt stood up. "I'll be at this office at sunrise. Don't be late."
They left at 10 that night. Walt had insisted on coming as far as the ranch gate, and Claire hadn't been able to argue him out of it. And Thomas had tried to come too, and been argued out of it by his mother, with a firmness that ended the conversation. The three of them, Jack, Claire, Walt, rode the wagon north in the dark, with the horses kept slow to stay quiet, and Jack with the rifle across his knees, and Claire with the revolver in her coat. She'd told him the layout of the ranch on the way out of Millhaven, where the bunkhouse was, where Hart's men would likely be posted, which way the study window faced, and whether the lock could be reached from outside if the window was unlatched. "The window was always unlatched," she said. "My father never locked it. Said a man who locked himself in his own study had something to be ashamed of." "Hart might have changed that," Jack said. "He might have." She paused. "But Hart doesn't know the ranch the way I know it. He knows the cattle operation. He knows the books. He doesn't know which floorboard in the hallway creaks, or which door hangs and has to be lifted to open quiet. And you do. I grew up in that house," she said. "I know every inch of it in the dark." They left Walt and the wagon a quarter-mile from the gate, with instructions to move if anyone came. And they went the rest of the way on foot, which was slower and harder, but quieter. And Jack followed Claire's lead, because this was her ground, and she moved through it like she owned it, which she did. There were 2 men at the gate, one near the barn, one, probably, walking a circuit that Claire had estimated at 12 minutes, based on how Hart liked to run a watch rotation, which she'd observed at enough cattle drives to know his patterns. They went around the east side of the fence, which took longer, but avoided all 3. The study window was unlatched. Jack went in first, not because she needed him to, but because if someone was in the room, he'd rather find out that way. And the room was empty and dark and smelled of old paper and leather, and something faint that Claire stopped moving for when she came through the window, just for one breath, one single, stopped moment. "He always kept a fire in here," she said, barely audible. "Even in summer. Just a small one." Jack didn't say anything. He understood the kind of moment that was. She moved to the desk, pulled open the bottom drawer on the right side. Her hands were sure and quick, and she didn't need light to know where she was going. "It's here," she said, and the sound in her voice, not triumph, not relief exactly, something older and more complicated, like a person putting down something heavy they'd been carrying a very long time. That sound was something Jack knew he'd remember. She pulled out the deed and the ledgers, 3 of them, thick and bound in dark leather, and wrapped them in the oilcloth Jack had brought, and tucked the bundle under her arm. They were back at the window when the door opened.
Not from outside, from the hallway. Jack spun. His hand found Claire's arm in the dark, and he pulled her against the wall beside the window. Both of them still. Both of them not breathing. A lamp came through the door. Behind it, Thaddeus Hart. He was in his shirt sleeves, and he held the lamp up and looked around the room, not searching exactly, more like a man who'd heard something and wasn't sure what he'd heard. His eyes moved across the dark. Jack had the rifle. He didn't raise it. His whole body said, "Don't move. Don't breathe. Let the dark do the work." Hart moved toward the desk. He opened the bottom right drawer.
The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. The silence of something that had been expected and arrived exactly as feared. Hart stood very still. His hand went into the empty drawer and felt around the bottom, slow and certain, like a man who needed to confirm with his fingers what his eyes had already told him. Then he straightened, and he turned and looked directly at the window. "Claire," he said. Not a question, not a surprise, just a name said in the dark, with all the weight of a man who had underestimated someone and knew it. She stepped out of the shadow. Jack stayed where he was, rifle at his shoulder, and the lamplight caught the barrel, and Hart saw it, and he was still. "It's over, Thaddeus," she said. Hart looked at her, and for one moment, just one, just a flash, he looked like a man who was genuinely tired. The reasonable expression was gone. The cold calculation was gone. Just a tired man in his shirt sleeves, holding a lamp in a room that used to belong to a better man than him. "You can't fight this alone," he said. "You've been gone 10 years. You don't know what it took to keep this place running." "I know what my father paid for it," she said. "I know what he carried. You don't get to carry his name on land you stole while his body was still warm." Her voice didn't shake, not once. "Step away from the door." "Claire, step away from the door," she said again. "Or I'll let Mr. Callahan make the decision for you. And I don't think either of us wants that." Hart looked at Jack. Jack looked back, steady, not threatening, and not yielding. Hart stepped aside. They went through the door and down the hallway and out the side entrance and across the dark yard without running, because running was noise and noise was trouble. And behind them the light in the study stayed where it was, and Hart didn't shout for his men, because Hart was still thinking, still calculating, still looking for the angle. And that was the one predictable thing about him. He would always reach for the chess move before he reached for the gun. It was the one thing that might save them tonight. They were halfway to the fence line when they heard him shout. They ran. They hit the fence line running, and Jack went through first and turned and caught Claire's arm as she came through, and they didn't stop, didn't slow, because behind them the shouts had multiplied, and the barn door had banged open, and the sound of boots on hard ground was getting louder and closer, and the dark that had helped them going in was working against them now. Walt heard them coming. God bless the man. Walt Sutton heard them coming and had the horses moving before they reached the wagon. And Jack grabbed the sideboard and vaulted up, and Claire was right behind him, and Walt didn't wait for a word. He cracked the reins, and the horses lunged forward, and the wagon lurched south at a pace that a feed store man from Millhaven had no business driving, and did it anyway without flinching. A shot cracked behind them, high and wide. Warning, not aim. Not yet. "Down," Jack said, and Claire was already low, one arm wrapped around the oilcloth bundle, the other gripping the wagon board, her face pressed close to the wood. Another shot. Closer. Jack came up over the seat back and put the rifle to his shoulder and fired once into the dark above the pursuing torchlight. Not at anyone, not to hit, but to make the point that this road went both ways, and heard the pursuit hesitate, horses pulling up,
Men reconsidering the math.
Go left at the fork, Claire said, her voice tight but controlled. Left takes us through the Garner Creek Basin. They'll expect us on the main road. Creek Basin's dry and rough, and it comes out half a mile from the north edge of town, away from the main gate. She looked up at him. They won't follow us into town. Not tonight. Not with Pratt already involved. Walt was already taking the left fork. The wagon bucked and rattled over the dry creek bed, and Jack held on with one hand and kept the rifle in the other. And behind them, the torchlight swung and paused and did not follow. And gradually the sound of pursuit faded into the dark. And the only sounds left were the horses breathing hard and the wheels grinding over cracked earth. And Walt Sutton saying under his breath something that was probably a prayer and was probably deserved. Claire sat up. She looked at Jack. Her hair had come half down, and there was dust on her face, and she was breathing fast, and her eyes were bright and alive, and she was holding that oilcloth bundle against her chest like it was something sacred, which it was, in its way. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She looked down at the bundle. "You?" "Fine." He lowered the rifle. "Walt?" "Still alive," Walt said grimly, "which I will be reminding Mary of every day for the rest of my natural life." Elias Pratt was not at his office at sunrise. He was there an hour before it, lamp burning, papers spread across his desk. And when Claire walked in with the deed and the ledgers, and Walt Sutton as a living witness to the night's events, Pratt looked at everything she laid on his desk, and then looked at her with an expression that Jack read as both professional assessment and something that bordered on respect. He read the deed. He read Gerald Montgomery's letter. He opened the first ledger to a page Claire indicated and compared the signature there to the signature on Hart's transfer document. And he did it slowly, holding the lamp close, not saying anything. Then he set both papers down. "The cross-stroke," he said. "Every single time," Claire said. 40 pages of ledger entries. Not once does it vary. Pratt looked at Hart's document. "This one goes right to left. Opposite." "Yes." "That's not age. That's not shaking hands. That's a different person." Pratt straightened up. "I can have the injunction filed when the clerk's office opens at 8. Once it's filed, Hart cannot legally transfer, sell, encumber, or dispose of any Montgomery property pending judicial review." He looked at her over his glasses. "But I want you to understand something, Miss Montgomery. The injunction stops him legally. It does not stop him physically. A man like Thaddeus Hart, I know what kind of man he is," she said. "Then you know that a court document means something to judges and nothing to hired hands." Pratt glanced at Jack. "You need to be somewhere he cannot reach you until the territorial marshal can be involved." "The marshal's office is in Helena," Jack said. 2 days by wire, 3 by road." "I've already sent a wire," Pratt said. "Last night, after you left." Both Jack and Claire went still. "I've been watching what Hart's been doing in this county for 6 months, Pratt said, with the quiet gravity of a man who had been carrying something in private and was setting it down. "The Montgomery deed was the thing I couldn't prove. You've just given me the proof." He looked at Claire. "Your father came to see me in April, 2 weeks before he died." The room went absolutely still. Claire's face did something complicated and painful. "He came to you." He said Hart was pressuring him. Said he was worried about what would happen to the ranch, to you, if something happened to him. He asked me what a man could do to protect his property from someone he'd trusted. Pratt paused. "I told him to get everything in writing and file it with the Territorial Land Office. He said he needed time." He stopped. He ran out of time. Claire put one hand flat on the desk. Jack watched her take that in, watched her absorb the specific grief of it. Not just her father's death, but the shape of it. The fact that he'd seen it coming and hadn't been able to stop it, and had tried to protect her the only ways he knew how, and it hadn't been enough. "He came to you," she said again, softer. "He loved that ranch," Pratt said. "But he talked about you more." He closed the ledger gently. "Let me do my job, Miss Montgomery. You do yours. Get somewhere safe before Hart decides a court filing is less trouble than making you disappear." Safe turned out to be Mary Sutton's sister's house on the east edge of Millhaven, which was a small, neat place belonging to a woman named Dorothea Crane, who had strong opinions and a shotgun she was not sentimental about, and who, when Walt explained the situation in about 4 sentences, said, "Put the horses in the back and come inside, and don't stand in the road like targets." Jack found himself liking Dorothea Crane immediately. Claire sat at Dorothea's kitchen table and spread the ledgers open and went through them page by page with the focused intensity of a person who had been waiting to do this for a very long time. Jack sat across from her and drank coffee that was significantly better than his own, and watched her work and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say, that the silence wasn't already saying better. Mary came in an hour after they arrived, and she and Claire sat together for a while in the back room. And Jack didn't know what passed between them, but when Claire came out, her eyes were red at the edges and her shoulders were straighter than they'd been all night. And he understood that sometimes grief and steadiness came out of the same moment if you were lucky enough to have the right person in it with you. Thomas was asleep on the parlor floor with his hat over his face. Jack stepped over him carefully. He was on the porch with his second cup of coffee when Claire came out and sat down in the other chair. For a while, they didn't speak. "He went to Pratt," she said finally. "I heard. He was trying to protect it. He knew something was wrong, and he was trying to fix it, and he just—" She stopped. "He ran out of time." "He also wrote to Mary," Jack said. "And he buried that key where only you would know to look for it. He was doing everything he could." She was quiet. "He sounds like a man who didn't give up on things," Jack said. "He never gave up on anything in his life." Her voice was low and steady and full of something fierce. "Which is why I'm not going to, either." The sun was coming up full now, burning the dew off the grass, and somewhere down the road, the town of Millhaven was waking up, and somewhere north of that, Thaddeus Hart was making decisions about what came next. And Jack sat with all of that, and with the woman beside him, and felt the particular weight of a moment that was balanced right on its edge. "The injunction will be filed in 2 hours," he said. "Marshall should have Pratt's wire by tonight." "By tonight," she said. "Hart will have figured out that the legal channel is closed, and he'll look for another way." She turned and looked at Jack. "He still has 6 men. Cord Reyes doesn't stop because a piece of paper says to." "No," Jack agreed. "And the ranch house still has everything in it. The furniture, the equipment, the cattle." Her jaw set. 200 head of registered Montana stock. My father's breeding records. Everything he spent 30 years building. You can't stop him from touching it before the marshal arrives. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "But I can make sure there are enough witnesses in that town that whatever he does to that ranch is seen and documented and can't be walked back." She looked at him. "I need to talk to people. The men who worked for my father before Hart took over. The neighboring ranchers who knew Gerald Montgomery. People who'll stand up in a territorial court and say what they know." Jack thought about it. "Len Barker runs a spread about 4 miles east. Knew your father for 20 years. He's testified in land court before." "Ed Pruitt," Claire said. "My father helped him through 2 bad winters. And the Calloway brothers." "And John Marsh, no relation, who bought a bull for my father in 1878 and has the papers to prove it. Jack looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. I've been thinking about this since I got on the train, she said. I just didn't know if I'd get far enough to use it. She met his eyes. I still might not. You will, Jack said. She looked at him, the same way she'd looked at him in the hallway the first night, reading him down to the bottom of it. You sound certain. I am certain. Why? He thought about it honestly. Because you're the kind of person who does what needs doing, he said. I've met maybe 3 people in my life I could say that about without reservation. Your father sounds like he was one of them. Something moved in her face, quiet and real. Thank you, she said, for all of this. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, he said. And he meant it simply, and she heard it simply. And that was that.
Elias Pratt sent Thomas with word at 8:15 that the injunction was filed and accepted. At 8:40, Cord Reyes walked into Dorothea Crane's front yard. Alone. No other riders. Just Reyes on his horse, looking at the house with the flat, patient look of a man running an errand he'd been paid for. Jack was on the porch before Reyes cleared the gate. That's close enough, Jack said. Reyes stopped. He looked at Jack the way he'd looked at him on the road, measuring, unimpressed. I got a message for the Montgomery woman. You can deliver it from there. A pause. Hart wants a meeting. Just him and her. No lawyers, no witnesses. Says he wants to work this out civil before it gets any uglier. Tell him to contact Elias Pratt, Jack said. He's not interested in Pratt. He doesn't have a choice. Reyes looked at him steadily. Mr. Callahan, I'm going to say this plain because I think you're a plain-speaking man. Hart is not someone you want to be on the wrong side of when the dust settles. He's going to have that ranch one way or another. You got a small operation you've worked hard on. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. The threat landed exactly the way Reyes intended it to. Clean and clear. Jack looked at him for a long moment. You tell Hart, he said, that the Double C has been standing through 8 hard years, and it'll be standing when he's a memory. And you tell him that if one fence post on my property is touched, I will personally make sure Elias Pratt knows where to find witnesses to every illegal thing Thaddeus Hart has done in this county since he forged a dead man's name. He kept his voice level. I am also a plain-speaking man. Reyes held his gaze. Then he turned his horse. At the gate he stopped without turning around. He's not done, he said. Just so you know. Neither am I, Jack said. Reyes rode off. Claire was in the doorway behind him. He'll go back and tell Hart the legal route is sealed. Yes, and Hart will decide the legal route was always the secondary plan. Jack turned. How long before he moves? Tonight, she said. He won't wait longer than tonight. He needs those ledgers destroyed before a marshal can secure them as evidence. She came out onto the porch and stood beside him, looking at the road where Reyes had gone. He'll come for us here, or he'll go straight to the ranch and start a fire. Jack went very still. The ranch house, he said. If those ledgers are the only originals, and they are, and if the house burns... We have them, Jack said. They're here. He doesn't know that. She looked at him. He thinks we left them at Pratt's office. He'll go for Pratt first. Jack was already moving. Thomas. Thomas appeared in the doorway, awake and alert, with the instinct of a boy who'd been listening all morning. Sir. Run to Pratt's office, fast as you can. Tell him to lock his doors and don't open them for anyone except the marshal. Tell him Hart may come tonight, and the ledgers are not at his office, but Hart thinks they are." Thomas was gone before the sentence finished. "Walt," Claire called. Walt appeared. "Already loading the shotgun," he said, from somewhere inside the house. Dorothea Crane appeared beside him, with a look that said she had anticipated this development and was not surprised, and had prepared accordingly. Claire turned to Jack. "I need to go to the ranch." "No." "Jack, not tonight. Not until the marshal—" "If Hart burns that house," she said, and her voice was controlled and fierce and right at the edge of something. 20 years of my father's life goes with it. Not just documents. His letters, his photographs. The things he left that have nothing to do with land or deeds or legal claims. Just his life. The proof that he was here and that he mattered." She stopped. Her voice was level, but her eyes were not. "I can't let that burn." Jack looked at her for a long time. He knew she was right. He also knew that going to the ranch tonight meant walking into exactly the ground Hart had the advantage on. His men, his territory, darkness and anger, and a man who had nothing left to lose if the legal channel was sealed. He also knew that telling her not to go was not an option. "We go together," he said. "We go armed. We go now, before dark, while we still have the light." He looked at Walt. "You stay here with Mary and Dorothea, and you don't open the door for anyone except Thomas." "Like hell," Walt said. "Walt." "Jack Callahan, I have known you for 8 years, and you are not going to tell me to sit in a woman's parlor while—" "I need someone here that I trust," Jack said. "Someone who'll make sure these ledgers get to the marshal if we don't come back." He held Walt's eyes. "Can you do that?" Walt looked at him. The argument went out of his face, replaced by something older and harder. "Don't make me have to," he said. Jack put a hand on his shoulder. Then he turned and loaded the rifle, and checked the revolver, and handed Claire a box of spare cartridges, and they walked out to the horses. They were half a mile out of Millhaven, moving north at a hard pace, when they saw the smoke. It rose black and thick against the evening sky, from the direction of the Montgomery Ranch, and they both saw it at the same moment, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say. Claire leaned forward in the saddle and pushed her horse faster. Jack rode alongside her and kept his rifle ready and watched the smoke climb higher, and thought about a man who built something from nothing, and a woman who was willing to ride into fire to finish what he started. And he thought that if Thaddeus Hart was at the end of that smoke, tonight was going to settle things one way or another, and there was not going to be a third conversation on a road. The ranch gate came into view. One of Hart's men was at it, and then the gate was behind them, because Claire had taken it at a gallop without slowing, and Jack was right beside her, and whatever was waiting on the other side was waiting for both of them. The man at the gate made the mistake of stepping into the road. Claire didn't slow down. Her horse hit him shoulder first and sent him spinning into the fence post, and she was past him before he hit the ground, and Jack cleared him a second later, and looked back just long enough to confirm he was down and not dead, and then looked forward. Because what was forward was enough to demand everything. The smoke was coming from the barn. Not the house, the barn. And even from horseback, Jack could feel the heat of it pressing against the evening air. Could hear the cattle in the paddock screaming that particular sound that cattle made when fire was near. That high, helpless sound that went straight through a person. 2 of Hart's men were at the paddock fence, and they weren't trying to calm the cattle. They were opening the gate, letting them out, scattering them into the dark so there'd be nothing to count, nothing to prove had ever been where the record said they were. Claire pulled up hard and was off her horse in one motion. "Hey!" Her voice cracked across the yard like a rifle shot. "Step away from that gate!" The men turned. They saw her. They saw Jack behind her with the rifle up. They ran.
Not toward them, away, around the back of the barn and gone, and Jack tracked them and didn't fire because they were running, and running men were not his problem right now.
His problem right now was the barn and the cattle and wherever Thaddeus Hart was, because Hart had not sent his men to do this and stayed home. "The cattle," Claire said. "I'll take the gate. You find Hart." Jack swung down. "Don't find him alone." "Jack, Claire." He held her eyes for one hard second. "Don't find him alone." She looked at him, nodded once, moved toward the house. Jack got the paddock gate closed before more than a dozen head had pushed through, and he worked the fence fast and hard and kept one eye on the barn and one on the house, and his mind on every sound in the yard. And the fire in the barn was high, but it was in the east section, the newer section, and the main structure was still holding if someone got water on it fast enough. He looked around. No one. Hart's men had scattered. The yard was empty and loud with the sound of the fire and the horses in the far corral going frantic and the cattle milling and bellowing. He went after Claire. She was in the hallway when he came through the front door, standing very still, facing the study. And he came up behind her and looked over her shoulder and understood why she'd stopped. Thaddeus Hart was in the study. He was at the desk, not searching this time, not looking for the deed he thought was there. He was standing behind the desk, with a lamp in one hand and his other hand on a stack of papers. And Jack understood in one cold second what he was looking at. Whatever Hart hadn't been able to take, whatever he couldn't move or sell or deny, he intended to burn in place. He hadn't seen them yet. Claire walked through the door. Hart looked up. She had the revolver in her hand, and it was pointed at his chest, and her arm was straight and steady, and her face had the same quality it had held since the moment she'd stepped out of shadow in this room the night before. Completely, utterly decided. "Put the lamp down," she said. Hart looked at her, at the gun, at Jack in the doorway. Something went through his face, fast, ugly, real. The reasonable expression he'd maintained through every confrontation until now was gone entirely. Stripped away the way a mask came off when the person wearing it had run out of reasons to keep it on. What was underneath was older and harder and genuinely dangerous. "You are making," Hart said very quietly, "a very serious mistake." "The lamp," Claire said. "Now." He set it down, slow. His eyes never left hers. "You think this is over," he said. "You got a lawyer and a piece of paper, and you think this is over." "I think you forged my father's signature," Claire said. "I think you've been planning this since before he was in the ground. I think the men you hired to run me off have already run. And I think the territorial marshal is going to be in this county by morning, because Elias Pratt sent for him 2 days ago." She took one step forward. "I think you're standing in my house, and I think it's time for you to leave it." "Your house." Hart's voice was flat. "Claire, I kept this place alive for 6 years while you were back east, pretending it didn't exist. 6 years of drought and debt and—" "You were paid," she said. "Well and fairly every year. The ledgers show exactly what you were paid, and exactly what you skimmed over it." She didn't flinch. "My father knew. He was too decent a man to accuse you without proof. That decency cost him everything, and you used it to rob him." Her voice thinned. "You are not going to stand in his study and tell me what you're owed." Hart looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved. Not toward her. Sideways, fast, his hand going to his hip, and Jack was already moving, but Claire was closer, and she didn't step back, she stepped forward, and the barrel of the revolver came up and she said, "Don't." And the word landed with a weight that stopped Hart's hand halfway to his gun. He froze. The room held its breath.
I will, she said. Don't think I won't. Hart looked at her eyes and believed her. His hand dropped. Jack crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled Hart's gun from the holster and stepped back and kept him between them. Hart stood with his hands open at his sides and his jaw tight, and the look of a man who had spent his life being the one who held leverage and was experiencing for the first time what it felt like to have none. "On your knees," Jack said. "I'm not on your knees, Hart. I won't ask twice." Hart went down. Not gracefully. The way a man went down when he didn't have a choice and needed everyone to know he was noting it. Claire looked at him kneeling in the middle of her father's study, and she lowered the revolver, and the look on her face was not triumph. It was grief and exhaustion and a bone-deep relief that had nowhere to go, yet not fully. Not until this was completely done. "This isn't finished," Hart said, looking up at her. "You think a court in this territory is going to side with a woman who's been gone 10 years over a man who's kept this operation solvent? The court's going to look at 2 signatures," Claire said, "and a letter from a dead man, and 6 years of ledger entries, and a deed registered in my name by my father the year I turned 17. She looked at him steadily. "And then it's going to hear from Elias Pratt, and Mary Sutton, and Len Barker, and every rancher my father helped through a hard winter. And when it's done hearing all of that, it's going to tell you what I'm telling you now." She put the revolver in her coat. "Get out of my house." The marshal's name was Garrett Cole, and he arrived not the next morning, but that same night, 4 hours after Pratt's wire, riding hard with 2 deputies, because Pratt had apparently written a wire that conveyed appropriate urgency, and Cole was a man who understood urgency when he read it. He found Thaddeus Hart sitting in the Montgomery Ranch kitchen, under the watch of Jack Callahan, and a rifle, which Hart had spent 4 hours attempting to transform through conversation and negotiation into something less formal, and which Jack had spent 4 hours not responding to, which seemed to have affected Hart more than the gun itself. Cole read Pratt's documents at the kitchen table. He read the letter. He looked at the signatures. He put his hat on the table and rubbed the back of his neck and said, "How long has this been going on?" "Since May," Claire said. "The barn fire?" "Hart's men. 2 of them ran. I can identify both." Cole looked at Hart. "Anything you want to say?" Hart said several things, all of them variations on the theme of legitimate claim and legal process, and the unreliability of a woman with a grudge. Cole listened to all of it with the expression of a man who had heard similar speeches before and knew what they generally preceded. When Hart finished, Cole stood up. "Thaddeus Hart, I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, forgery, and destruction of property, pending full investigation. You have the right to counsel." He looked at his deputies. "Take him." Hart stood. He looked at Claire one last time, not with the reasonable expression, not with the cold calculation, just with a kind of compressed fury that had nowhere to go, and knew it. "You got lucky," he said. "No," she said. "I got here." They took him out. Jack set the rifle down on the table and let out a breath that felt like it had been held since approximately the moment he'd found her in the grass. And Claire sat down in the chair across from him and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. And for a moment, they were both just very still and very quiet, in the way of people who have been moving fast through something difficult and have arrived, suddenly and without full preparation, at the other side of it. "The barn can be rebuilt," Jack said. "Yes." She looked up. "Most of the cattle held." "Cole will round up the ones that scattered. That's standard." "I know." She was quiet. "The house is intact." "Intact," he agreed. She looked around the kitchen, really looked at it, the way a person looked at something they'd been afraid they'd never see again. The table, the lamp, the particular way the light fell, the simple, irreplaceable fact of it still standing. "He was sitting in that chair," she said, low. "The morning they found him. Right there." She looked at the chair in the corner. Old, worn. The kind of chair a man sat in every morning of his life. Until one morning, he didn't get up from it. He would have had his coffee. He would have been thinking about the cattle count, about whether the north pasture needed rotating, about all the 10,000 small things a ranch demands of you every single day. She stopped. He didn't deserve to die with that hanging over him. No, Jack said, he didn't. But he tried to protect it. Her voice steadied. Right up until the end, he was trying. He left you the key, Jack said. He left you the ledgers and the deed and the letter to Mary. He left you everything you needed. He looked at her. He knew you'd come. Something broke open in her face. Not collapse, not weakness. Something more like a wall that had been holding too long, finally being allowed to come down, because the thing it was protecting was finally safe. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. 1 breath. 2. Then she put her hands back on the table and lifted her chin, and the wall rebuilt itself. Not quite the same shape as before, but standing. I owe you more than I can repay, she said. You don't owe me anything. Jack, you'd have found your way here, he said. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe it would have been harder. But you'd have found it. He meant it. I just happened to be at the right fence line. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not that simple, she said. Don't pretend you are. He almost smiled, caught most of it. No, ma'am. The injunction held. The territorial court convened 3 weeks later in Millhaven, and it took the judge 4 hours of testimony and 40 minutes of deliberation to determine that the transfer deed bearing Gerald Montgomery's name was a forgery, that the original deed of title registered to Claire Montgomery was valid and binding, and that all claims Hart had filed against the Montgomery Ranch were null. Thaddeus Hart was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge for fraud and forgery and the destruction of property. Cord Rays and the Dillon brothers were located within a week. Rays in a town 30 miles south, the Dillons trying to cross into Wyoming, and they faced their own accounting, which was less complicated but no less final. Mary Sutton cried in the courtroom when the verdict came down. Walt put his arm around her, and Thomas sat up very straight, like a young man practicing how to carry good news with dignity. Elias Pratt walked out of the courthouse and shook Claire's hand and said, "Your father would be satisfied," which was the most Pratt-like thing he could possibly have said, and which was exactly right. Claire thanked him and didn't cry, which Jack had come to understand was not because she didn't feel things, but because she felt them somewhere internal, somewhere deep, and dealt with them there. She cried once. He knew of once. It was 3 days after Cole took Hart away, after the adrenaline had burned off, and the ranch hands who'd scattered during Hart's takeover had started coming back, 1s and 2s, men who'd worked for Gerald Montgomery, and who came back to his daughter, with their hats in their hands, and their heads down a little. And she'd met every one of them at the gate, and shaken their hands, and called them by name. Late that night, when the house was quiet, Jack had been walking back from checking the corral, and he'd seen her sitting on the north pasture fence alone in the dark, and he'd stood back far enough to give her privacy, and close enough to be present if she needed it. And the sound she made, sitting there by herself at her father's grave, not loud, not long, just real, was something he would never repeat to anyone. When she walked back to the house, she passed him and said, "I know you were there," without stopping. "I know," he said. She went inside. He stood there for a while in the dark and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who carried things alone until they found someone they trusted enough
to let stand nearby while they put the weight down. He thought it meant something. He thought it might mean something specific.
He rode back to the Double C on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after he'd ridden away from it to check on strays. The place looked the same. Dry grass, tired fence line, the east section still sagging, the banknote still coming due in October. He stood in his own kitchen and looked at it, and felt the strangeness of returning to a life that had been perfectly adequate before, and now felt like a shirt that no longer quite fit. He told himself that was natural, that a man who'd been through what he'd been through needed time to settle. He was on the porch with his coffee 4 days later when he heard hoofbeats coming from the north. He knew the horse before he saw the rider. Claire came through his fence gap at a steady trot and pulled up in front of the porch and looked down at him from the saddle with those clear gray eyes that did not look away from things. "I need a ranch manager," she said. "Someone who knows cattle. Someone who knows the territory." She paused. "Someone I trust." Jack looked up at her. "That's a significant job." "It is. The Montgomery operation is 10 times the size of mine." 12 times, she said. "I checked." He was quiet for a moment. "What happens to the Double C?" "That would be up to the man who owns it," she said. "A man who worked it for 8 years and has the right to do whatever he sees fit with what he built." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to give up anything, Jack. I'm asking you if you want to build something bigger." He thought about his wife, who had looked at him once and said, "I didn't know you were that kind of man," and who had loved him anyway, and who had known him well enough to know the kind of man he was capable of being when he stopped being careful about it. He thought about the north fence line, and the woman face down in the grass who had looked up at him with gray eyes that had already decided they weren't done yet. He thought about what it meant to be at the right fence line at the right moment and have the sense to understand that. "I've got a fence line on the east side that needs mending before winter," he said. "I'll send men tomorrow," she said. "It'll be done in a day." "And I've got a banknote in October." "I'll have Pratt draw up fair terms." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming over the ridge the way it did, and the grass was still dry, and the land was still hard and demanding and indifferent. And Claire Montgomery sat in the saddle like she'd been born to it, which she had, and looked at him like he was the only fixed point in a moving landscape. "All right," he said. She didn't smile. She did something better. She exhaled, just slightly, the way a person exhaled when something they'd been hoping for arrived and turned out to be real. "Then come north when you're ready," she said. "There's work to do." She turned her horse and rode back the way she'd come, and Jack watched her go, and finished his coffee and stood up. He went inside and started packing. Gerald Montgomery had built the largest ranch in the Northern Territory from 6 men and a prayer, and ground that nobody else wanted. And he had done it by knowing which things were worth fighting for, and holding on to them without apology and without surrender. His daughter had come back from a long way away with nothing but her name and her father's truth, and the particular kind of stubbornness that wasn't stubbornness at all, but was simply the refusal to let the wrong people win. And she had fought for every inch of what was hers, and she had not lost a single foot of it. And Jack Callahan, who had once stood at a moral crossroads and chosen wrong, and spent years building something quiet and honest enough to live with himself inside, rode north that afternoon towards something that was not quiet at all, loud and large and alive and entirely worth it. Some debts weren't owed in money. Some fences weren't built with wire. And some people, put together by circumstance on a dry July morning at the edge of a field, built something that outlasted everything that had tried to stop it. And the Montgomery Ranch,
and the two people who would run it together stood on that Montana ground for the rest of their lives as proof that the right person at the right fence line could change everything.